Hello and greetings from Rockaway Park. This is Steve Lake with another Sound of Unrest podcast. The Bristol graffiti scene is famous throughout the world and thrown up some of the brightest stars in that graphic firmament. Today we're talking to one of those people, Rowdy. So sit back and listen. Where did you grow up, Rowdy? Did you grow up in Bristol?
I didn't actually grow up in Bristol. I grew up in Radstock for my sins, and somewhere I spent half my life trying to get away from, and now I'm sort of back in the area. So, yeah. It's a bit of a... is it a love-hate relationship, or is it more of a hate relationship? I think hate's too strong a word. But
with Radstock?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. I think getting into it just for a little bit, the only sort of relatively interesting place to visit close by was Bath, but you always felt like a bit like scum when you went to Bath, whereas I'd go to Bristol and always felt quite well received and a bit more like-minded. So and in a way you sort of wear that as a bit of a badge of pride, but you find with Radstock you're a bit stuck and not getting anywhere, so it's a sort of place that can hold you back, though I think it's got some interesting old history to it and stuff, and some of the surrounding countryside's quite cool, and it used to be quite a red kind of place. I'm not so sure these days quite what it is, to be honest.
People don't realise how much mining took place there, which is, I think, like a lot of those old mining places, the mines move out and nothing's there to replace it.
Yeah, and the other tragedy is, I think, is it had two different railway lines intersecting it, so it would have been a great sort of travel hub as well to get to all the sort of quite decent places locally that we do have sort of kind of on our doorstep, so it's definitely...
Now, I'm really aware of that round there, that you walk around and there's all these old disused railway lines and bridges and stuff, and it's really fascinating.
And exactly, for a walk it could be quite a nice thing just to sort of stumble across and sort of go, and you get the kind of ghosts and the kind of sort of essence of what was once there, and it's not all of it's housing estates yet, sprawling kind of estates that really don't do much either, but it's beginning to go that way to some degree, and some of it has been made in the cycle tracks, which is great. It took a long time to get there, but they're things that are available. Looking up stuff about you on the internet, it says you kind of got into the graffiti scene in about 1987. Would that be right? That's right. And as it happened, it wasn't so much Bristol or Bath or anything for that matter. It was more travelling to London, and so I used to get the train with my mum and brother to go and see my gran, and we'd always go to West London, and so stuff in the mid-80s started appearing around Westbourne Park, Ladbroke Grove, Royal Oak, Paddington, and that stuff. As soon as I started seeing that, I was like, what the hell's this? And got very interested. A bit before I started spraying, just the sort of way it was sort of put up on the train tracks. It was sort of, I suppose I was quite interested in comic books as a kid, not to any sort of obsessive degree, but I liked that kind of visual art. And then I started seeing these names appear on the train tracks, and I was just pulled in sort of straight away. It was a really nice alternative to something to look at, to sort of break up the monotony of the train journey, but also as the train's slowing down, you've got these names appearing, and it's like welcome to London in this sort of alternative way, and it was just this way of accessing something, because I couldn't really access art, particularly where I lived, and we'd go to the museum, the Natural History Museum and stuff, but a lot of places can be sort of steeped in really old history, and that wasn't quite doing it for me either, as interesting as it is. So that was something that just spoke out to me, and I'm not entirely sure why it did at such a young age, but it did nonetheless.
Graffiti was always kind of associated with the like hip hop culture. So were you into hip hop?
I think when I got into graffiti, it got me into hip hop pretty quickly as well. There's two sort of, I probably was listening to sort of quite mainstream chart 80s music, Top of the Pops and all that sort of stuff before, and you would get a decent tune on every so often. That wasn't unheard of either, but it definitely meant there was a window into that world. Suddenly we were all looking at New York and what that was doing, and so rap music was blowing up, and so was graffiti, so it just seemed to be the thing to jump on,
Were you good at art at school?
Not particularly, no. This is another thing that I sort of look at, some of the sort of skill set that I have. I only got like a C in art, and everything else I just did miserably in. I mean, I think I had some talent, but I just wasn't interested in education. It just didn't, it just didn't really sort of fire me up. I was just more interested in socialising messing about. I liked sports to a degree, but almost more outside school. So it was more sort of stuff you could do to entertain yourself outside school, and school was a good social network, but it wasn't really me, you know.
Well, I totally identify with that.
At school, yeah, we used to have to sort of be in a sort of the class band, and we used to play percussion, and we were always out of time, and we used to get shouted at all the time, and it was just miserable. You would just it's like when you're at school and they say, you know, they ask you to stand up and read. It was that same sort of anxiety and horrible feeling of like, oh, we've got to do this again, and we're going to get shouted at in a minute, you know, and we did, and we always seemed to get the blame.
Yeah. So where did the name Rowdy come from?
So the name Rowdy sort of came about because, as I was sort of alluding to a little bit earlier, when you come from a town where there's not a huge amount going on, you sort of make your own entertainment. So while we were maybe trying to paint the wall and make something look nice, someone else would be trying to tear it down or smash the windows in a building adjacent. So there was always this kind of slightly raucous behaviour going on, but I'd go to something like Midsummer Norton, and there used to be a lot of pub brawling and fighting, and to some degree I got caught up in that, you know, because I was fairly peaceful. I mean, I used to once upon a time go on a few CND marches, but with that coming of age, I just found, you know, you kind of, you'd either get picked on or you want to be able to sort of like at least stand up for yourself. So I got in a few fights, and didn't always come out that badly, but, you know, I did end up in police cells as well for that sort of behaviour. And I thought, well, what's going on here? You know, it's not totally me, but it's a bit of the characteristics of the neighbourhood I'm in, I suppose. So I thought, well, and people used to sort of joke, well, let's go down Midsummer Norton and get a bit rowdy, you know, and go out and have a few pints or just some street drinking. And then I kind of liked the term rowdy. And I thought, why don't I sort of, because I was already been doing graffiti for a few years, I thought, why don't I put it use it as a vehicle and a word to sort of be positive, but also get a bit raucous on the wall. Use that so there's an energy thing. I thought, well, if I get rowdy on the wall, it'll just have a little bit more oomph, you know. Yeah. So I dropped the sort of signatures I was previously using, because I just thought, oh, it's just got more interesting connotations, and I kind of like that. And really, I think when I claimed that name, the fighting kind of dissipated really, and I just looked towards, you know, just getting even more motivated to do paintings on walls, mainly with spray cans. Yeah.
So how did you get into doing graffiti? Did you meet people that were already doing it?
Yeah, I suppose one thing was the London thing. I was very much driven by that, and then a couple of books came out. Subway Art came out by Thames and Hudson. That came out in 1984, and I didn't catch the first wave of that. But then a couple of years later, Spray Can Art came out, which was also on Thames and Hudson, and they had some amazing photography by Martha Cooper and Henry Chalfont. But the first book, Subway Art, just captured the New York subway scene that was really underground, and just put some amazing sort of pictures and stories into our lives. And then Spray Can Art was all around the world. Subway Art did the sort of damage and was the precursor to a lot of graffiti happening all over the planet, really. So they brought that book out a couple of years later, and that also included sort of snapshots of what was going on in the West Midlands with Goldie, with 3D in Bristol. So suddenly it was like, right, this is coming closer to home, and it was a bit like a toolkit. You could at least look at it and get a few extra clues, because obviously we didn't have the internet back then, and publications didn't really cover that kind of stuff. And these two books came out, and they did an incredible job of, getting people's imaginations going, and something to sort of aim for a little bit, you know. And there was some high standards there as well. Yeah. It was really something to look up to. So someone bought a copy of that into school, and I was 13 at the time, and I went, oh my God, this is what I've been seeing in London, you know. Yeah. And then I went another trip to London, and we went down to Wimbledon, and one of the guys who was a couple of years above me, there was a painting of his just down by Wimbledon station, and I was like, no way. And I said to him, I saw a cab piece down at Wimbledon, and I was thinking, is that him? Is that anything to do with him? And he was like, yeah, that was me and this other guy, Rep. And I was like, oh, no way. And then there was another kiddie in my year, because one or two people started doing it. There's another kiddie, I won't name his name, only because he sort of got into lots of other trouble later on, like, you know, and, you know, even stuff like armed robbery. I mean, I think that's the thing, you know, but he was really good at getting me into it, because he said, right, let's go down to like the local paint shop, we'll steal some spray cans, you know, and that's a rite of passage. You used to steal all the spray paint back then, you know. If you're going to go and do something illegal, you might as well start off by stealing the paint, because you didn't have much disposable cash anyway. You might occasionally buy the odd tin just to show a bit of faith and to kind of coax them into trusting you. Just get a can or two here and there, because probably now and again I've done stuff with like a Sharpie marker pen, but once you've got the spray paint, once you sort of hit that, it's like taking a drug really, but I think in a good way, you know? And so I remember just painting some big orange port cabin just near the railway lines in Radstock, and just did something totally freestyle. I tried to do it all at once, you know, with like some palm trees, and it said limit, and it was, but silver looked quite good on the orange, and it was, you know, and I just went, oh wow, yeah, I definitely want more of this, you know.
Did you realise quite quickly that you had a talent?
Do you know what? I reckon even for the first 2 or 3 years, there's the odd time I thought about giving it up, but I couldn't. I remember producing something in 1990 where I thought, oh okay, yeah, that's looking better, and so. Because it was pretty self-taught. Like I said, there was 1 or 2 people older than me, but we were all just having to learn it ourselves. There wasn't like some people who... Because there is this sort of thing that you sit in the subway art and where you get sort of schooled by people that are a few years older, and they sort of take you under their wing. I mean, unfortunately, didn't have too much of that, so we just had to figure it out ourselves, really. And occasionally you maybe go to Bristol and watch some people paint and go, oh, right, that's how they do it, or they get that paint, or... More often than not, the bigger you paint, it's actually easier, because we were doing these quite small pieces, and you find that's a limitation right there, to try and sort of paint skillfully with cans that are sort of not necessarily designed to sort of be sprayed on walls. They were kind of more for sort of painting cars and stuff. With nowadays you get like really specialist spray paints, and it's really easy, you know. You know, back then you just make do with whatever colours you managed to sort of get your hands on. You might nick a pot of emulsion out of someone's shed and paint out the wall. And now, you more often than not, you might not construct some art like that. But I think when you are limited, it's so much better. So it gives you a really sort of useful skill set to build on. Because when you do make a few quid, or you can afford to buy the paint you need and do a nicer painting, it's based on all that sort of struggling and stuff, you know. So in a way, the long game is what I'm all about. That was just part of that kind of journey, you know. And so just hinting at that when you was asking me about getting better, or when do you realise you're good, it's just, I think when you know you're in it for the long haul, you're going to see some improvements, and then you begin to realise, even looking at something like this, quite naive, I quite don't mind that element. You realise that is part of the art sometimes as well, but maybe when you were younger, it's got to be all slick and clean and what have you, you know. And we realise after a while there's different strengths to play to. Even to this day, I still really enjoy painting walls, because whether it's legal or illegal, you turn up to a spot, wherever it might be, and really it's got to be done in those few hours. There's no sort of going back as such. You've just got to like get it nailed and get on with it and be fast, alert, you know, and be really productive. And it has all that energy that I think we would both concur that we really like in our art forms. You know,
Bristol is really world renowned as a centre for graffiti, and it seems to be, you know, not only tolerated but actually promoted. When you started going and painting in Bristol, was that already a thing, or was it still...
I mean, I think for us we felt there was some tolerance, but generally there wasn't. I think some of the sort of first paintings I actually did, it took me probably about five years of being into my sort of graffiti career to sort of go, oh right, I'm just about good enough to approach Bristol and do some stuff here, because, you know, we held it in really high regards. And what you would tend to get is you get a couple of places, like there was one in Barton Hill, there was another one just behind Old Market in Newtown, and there was Bedminster Skate Park. So these places would have been classed as Hall of Fames, where you go and do your best painting. And back in '89, when Bristol was sort of really peaking, there was a wave of artists painting at Barton Hill. That was like the sort of epicentre of it, and they would go all around the city putting their tags up, and eventually it got so much interest by the police in particular, there was a big bust, and so they did one of the biggest sort of graffiti busts in the country at the time, called Operation Anderson, and a lot of people kind of, you know, there was a core of maybe 10, 12 people that had these dawn raids happen to them, and as a result of that, I mean, I wasn't in that, but as a result of that, they got hold of another maybe 30 people, and it shut a lot of people's careers down. There was a guy in Bath called Catch 22 who never really did much after that. You know, I think when people are on bail and stuff, and you get this a lot with London graffiti writers when they've not been prosecuted yet, they still carry on or put up a different name. But once they get the sort of kibosh, some of them stop, or some of them just carry on because they're a bit more kind of like, fuck it, you're not stopping me doing this shit. You're crazy, aren't you? But to some extent, it had really sort of culled the scene, and then a lot more people got into raving and stuff like that. And so we're getting into the early 90s now. By the time the sort of court cases and stuff happened, so there wasn't that much activity in the early 90s, and you almost felt like perhaps the whole thing's just going to die off. And that's kind of when some of the guys I used to work with, who were sort of based in Radstock and Frome, we go into Bristol a lot and find places to paint, such as ones I've hinted at. And then we met up with some lads from Kingswood called DBZ, which was Soccer and Cato and Tess. And they later started working with Banksy for a while. And there was another lad, Just. And he was from Bath. And we just occasionally meet up in places like Brislington and start going about our business, really. And we would just do our best. If it was a new spot like the Brislington one, we'd just do our best to hold it down, really, try and do something decent.
Yeah.
You know, and I think quite a lot of us used to look reasonably gnarly. It's like, do you really want to bother with this, you know? And we just kept taking that approach to different spaces, really. And slowly, I think things just began to change. But also, as you sort of begin to get more into Bristol, you realise, like, places like Easton are very, you know, it was one of the first places. I mean, this was moving on to 98 now, but I remember I was painting there with a guy called Boswell who's done some stuff here, and people started going, do you want us to get you a beer or anything? You know, do you want to, you know, and they just turn up with some red stripe or give you a spliff or something. You're going, hold up a minute, like, what? Yeah, this never happens. Normally either the police turn up or we've got to leg it or we're out at night. It's always quite clandestine. And then you started realising, I mean, just like it was in St Paul's, where the drug dealing was open, but, you know, if you weren't looking for trouble, you know, most people would just leave you be, and things sort of run themselves in their own kind of way, really. And you sort of got to realise, once you start meeting people, you get more of a sense of how the city's working, really. And they were some of the first clues, really, to me, apart from one or two safe havens where you could paint and not get arrested, that, you know, you could start to build an environment a bit like how it is at Rockaway. You can build an art environment if you just stick at it, or like a traveller's site. And we've done that in various places as the years went by. We'd have a nice spot in Radstock where it was all like the old railway works. And then we found a place like Beecham Cliff School near Bath. There was an old school down there near the railway line, and we sort of secured that to some degree. And then you find these spots like I said in Brislington where you could just get on with it. So for quite a long time you had a lot of places where it was kind of tolerated, but there was nowhere legal to work.
Yeah.
And then in the late 90s, Inky and Banksy put on a thing called Walls on Fire, and we got invited to paint at that, and that was a big load of hoardings down by the watershed. And then some guys then started putting adverts to go with their art, and it was a bit like, you could just tell things were sort of beginning to change. They were doing some adverts for record shops and various things, and you went, oh right, yeah, this is just going into a different gear, because we were sort of in a way a product of the 90s. We started coming of age more, even though we were from the 80s.
Yeah.
And then as you went into the 2000s, you know, more spots started opening up, and then around the mid-2000s, suddenly everyone wanted a bit of it, you know. It was like, suddenly Joe Public had woken up to it. As they had done a little bit in the 80s when it popped up with things like Basquiat and Keith Haring. Yeah. And to some extent when it hit London in the mid-80s with The Clash and all that sort of stuff, there was another reawakening from the public going, oh, this is cool. It's like, you're pretty late on this, but it's still cool. And there was a lot of mileage with collectors, with commissions and stuff like that, you know.
Things always took a lot longer to kind of get to a public awareness.
They did,
because it wasn't the internet. So people were doing stuff. A few cool kids kind of like get into it, and it spread slowly. Whereas now, you do something, and the advertising guys and the big companies, if they see it, they're on it immediately.
Absolutely, yeah. When we have to wait a decade for something to manifest a bit and see some results. Now it's just instantaneous, isn't it? Really, and it's quite strange to having been in that world and then this world. How you sort of operate between the two, because
I mean, and it's interesting. Something that was illegal, and you could say was, a kind of way of resisting authority, creating your own culture and your own space. Now they use kind of graffiti style on adverts for banks and finance companies. And this, that, and the other. And did you start getting commissions or people asking you
I've
to do
never,
things?
fortunately, had to do too much stuff like that sort of, say, mainstream. It's not really a route I've gone down, though. Interestingly, I have had my artwork used by the National Lottery, the Post Office, and Samson, none of which I've given permission for, yet they've used it and I've not seen a penny. And they've done exactly what you say, sort of, jump on that kind of either illegality or that sort of coolness, But you can't go up against those sort of lawyers, really. It's just impossible. And maybe, there's just nothing you can do about it. Now, some of these companies are a bit more savvy. They know that it could cause legal problems. So they'll either get someone to do some rubbish graffiti, or, they might make a nod to it, but they can't just sort of hijack the space. So obviously some would argue, it's the public space. What can you do, because sometimes people sample my work in their paintings. And I used to get a bit cross about that, but now I see it more as a compliment. But sometimes I'm thinking, the only reason you're selling that painting to some degree is because it's got mine and maybe, say, Sweet Tooth's work in it. And you think, but then if you go back to hip-hop, for example, they were sampling all kinds of stuff, and so there is something to be said about it as well. It just depends how you do it, But some of the best hip-hop tracks, it could be that Can I Kick It when they use Lou Reed's thing, But apparently Tribe Called Quest never got any money for that to this day, so in a way they might have totally nicked it, but it was a good track, and it helped you get into something maybe like Lou Reed or whatever, so it can work when you see the bigger picture.
Do you see doing graffiti as political in any way? I mean, your stuff is not, some graffiti artists obviously are absolutely political and political messages. How do you feel about
I think even harking back to the early days we were getting on about earlier, there is a political act. It is sort of challenging sort of land space, just the act of doing it. If you spray a big tag up on someone's house, you might made the area look a bit run down, and that would have meant their property value was going to plummet a little bit, and now it's sort of gone the other way. We're like the sort of darlings of gentrification, and it's a real problem. Or as someone nicely put it, in fact, the guy called Drax, countrification, is a better word. And so we've been on both sides of that, and I think you do take it on board. And I was chatting to someone recently. If you're in France, a lot of people paint up on out in the rural places. And we don't do that so much in Britain, painting up sort of people's barns and stuff like that. And I think, well, that's industrial farming. I'd love to see more stuff going onto buildings like that, really, because most things have been done at some point, and you're looking at what's left to do, and what some of the new things that people are doing at the moment are sort of like abseiling down buildings and writing their name, one letter stacked on top of the other. And that's quite effective. And you've got a show on at the moment with 10 Foot and Tox, a big show in London, and that's all about, the primary element to their work is tagging, and most people hate tagging, even people who go, I quite like the street art and graffiti, but I don't like the tagging, and that's getting a little bit of a resurgence at the moment. You see a lot more tags on the tube, on the insides of the tube train, and I think at the moment that's kind of like interesting, because it's like proper sort of vandalism and property damage, and people don't like that. They can't sort of square that one up very well, and that's brilliant when people are going, I don't know what to do about this, it's a bit unmanageable, because you like that in music, don't you, when a band comes along and they're like hard to manage, they're often quite good at the same time, aren't they? They've got something about them. So we've gone out various friends the last couple of years, and we've made some Palestine paintings as well, and that's important to try and use that vehicle where you can. And there are obviously many other sort of climate and other sort of things that you could lend your hand to, whether you feel qualified to or not is another matter. So there have been a few things that I've got a bit more political in recent times just because they need saying, but obviously you still feel really ineffectual, you know.
Yeah, but I mean the act of doing it is political in a way.
Yeah,
as well,
that's
because
it.
it's reclaiming the space, because the space is just like dominated by big corporations, advertisements everywhere, everything's sponsored, everything's got a fucking label on it. So.
Totally. I mean, what we're seeing now in Bristol, and it might be an advent of the Greens, they're starting to grey out some of the graffiti walls in Bristol, which is strange, the ones that have almost become legal. And also what we're seeing is companies like Out of Hand and Build Hollywood starting to take graffiti spots and put up like temporary kind of hoardings so they can put all their adverts in there. So people are jumping in onto what we've sort of built and taken the risk to do, and then turning that into some kind of cheap form of money and advertising. So we are sort of in some time perhaps where we've had our sort of golden age, and now we've got to almost fight the Green Party and people who were meant to be really down, like Out of Hand, you know, that's what's sort of happening in Bristol. So though I sort of welcome the fact maybe the Greens have got in, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better for, you know. And the way property is in Bristol, it's a go-to spot, the way Airbnb are killing Bristol, you know, and, you know, how do you sort of rectify this, you know, and so a lot of the artists are moving out to the fringes, you know, and I think some people now, if they've never visited Bristol before, they're going, what the hell is this? You smell weed everywhere, you know, you see paintings everywhere, you know, and you sort of see people looking quite alternative, and you're thinking, wow, I mean, for how long, who knows? You know,
but and it's nice.
It's really nice, you know, and that's the thing. Each decade, things have sort of slowly improving, but I think that's the thing now with this country. You know, up until maybe about 10 years ago, I felt like, you know, we seem to be getting on top of our races, and we seem to be... You know, art seems to be in a reasonably good place, you know, and now you're just seeing just everything get sort of taken apart and kind of, you know, or maybe it's me getting older, but I feel
I don't think. I often think that, but it's not. It's just everything's being sort of clamped down. You know.
and really pointless. It's just a waste of public money because most of it's inherently good, and if you don't like it, you can move somewhere else. If you think, Bristol's a bit too alternative, it's like go and live somewhere else and move back to London. You know, just sell up and go and live in the country. You know. So a lot of these people are getting this sort of art and culture for free more often than not. They're not paying like a council tax on that. You know, this is what's making the city look cool.
With your own art, you obviously developed from like spray painting walls to thinking, I'd actually like to.
Oh yeah, definitely. I started doing canvases from the mid-90s, you know, and I was always looking at alternatives because I think that there's the one thing where you sort of maybe subscribe to hip-hop graffiti, but then you realise, I quite like doing characters, or what if I paint that kind of 3D surface? That could look quite interesting, or let's just get together and do a jam and throw paint at the wall, you know. It's like, let's try and get some different results, and I found canvas was one way that, because a lot of it was kind of group-related art I was doing for a number of years. Sometimes individual, but I realised if I do paint on a canvas, it's totally me dictating this piece, and you know, there's a sense of empowerment, but there's also a way of working differently, and it's like just keeping your skills sharpened up. So even when money wasn't available, it's like, some of this stuff might come good in 10 years time or 15 years time. So I kind of embarked on canvas painting mid-90s for a while, and then I kind of did one or two sort of regular full-time jobs, and then around 2000, I decided to stop working in any conventional job and try and be an artist full time. And so around 2005, I actually got myself an art studio with another guy called Tinks in Montpellier and Bristol. I mean, he's passed on now, but that was an interesting place to work. And then you realise you're doing this full time as a job. It's like, right, better start making some canvases again, and just painting on any surface really, whether it's a bit of cardboard or a bit of wood. Trying to make this bit not sound too boring, because always the outdoor stuff sounds a bit more exciting. When you're on something like Instagram, it's like, I always get more likes if I do a wall, and you know. But I think the thing about the canvases is when you're in a studio, it's a slower kind of game, but really you're getting probably more often a more quality, more thought out product than you would on the street. Possibly. That's a difficult one to actually say. That's true.
They're different.
They're
things,
different
ways of expressing yourself, and both are perfectly valid.
They're both valid, but they do have some different things. Because obviously, if I do some of the abstract cityscape painting, I find it quite, it's quite meditative, and it just allows me to explore different colour palettes. I use more tertiary colours. when I'm in the studio, you wouldn't see me use beiges and sort of greys and stuff out in the street particularly. You know, I'm just going for the primary colours that sort of hit. So I'm very obsessed about colour. So the fact that when I get in the studio, I can employ all kinds of colour combinations and sort of get almost a bit scientific about it is good. And then you're trying to sort of tie in all these loose ends and actually make some money, and I think that comes from sort of notoriety on the streets. You have to keep your street game up in order to sort of get noticed in the gallery. But then I'm also interested, and partly why I started doing the abstract painting was I was like, right, I just want to do stand-up painting where people go, they can't really make any sort of judgment as such because it's abstract. It's up to them to make the judgment. I'm not trying to prescribe them anything. Whereas if I paint a crocodile on a canvas, like, oh, that's that guy who does the street stuff.
Yeah,
crocodile guy. And some people love that and they'll buy into that. That's what they want.
Yeah.
Whereas other people go, oh, I just love the colours of that. That says something to me, you know. And so I'm interested in those other subliminal messages, really. Yeah. So the gallery stuff just allows me different disciplines and to begin to think about people's interiors.
So you were able to get an agent quite easily?
Not particularly. Well, what happened was, I think when I was in mid-2000s, it started blowing up. I remember sort of doing a series of abstract paintings and got invited to be in a couple of shows. And then around that time, some auctions started popping off in London, and I got invited to be in one or two auctions. And that was a bit like, oh, do I really want to be doing this? But, you know, like, got some reasonable prices, you know, stuff did sell, and I was like, well, thank fuck for that, because some of my mates, they didn't sell, and it felt like, you know, it killed off their sort of art dream a little bit, you know. And I was like, and I knew even if it didn't sell, I'd still carry on. It's just how I am, sort of thing. Yeah. So I got a few sales, bit of encouragement, and just went, right, okay, I'll just keep going at it. And then 2009, this gallery in King's Cross called Sartorial, they had quite a big space. They invited me to do a solo show, so that was quite a big break at the time. And I went, right, okay, so, you know, I did one floor that was sort of crocodile-related paintings, and then I did another floor that was all abstract paintings, and, you know, it was a really significant amount of work that went into that show, and I started doing a couple of installations on the outside of the building, and I thought, right, I've really sort of planted myself a bit more into the art world now, and then sort of things like life sort of got in the way a bit around 2010, you know, like my studio. I mean, I'm not going to dwell on it now. This would be the bit where Mark goes, oh, did I know this or not? But my studio caught on fire. And, I lost a lot of stuff.
About that.
And it just put me back a year or two. But again, long game, just keep going, pick it up again, you know. And then I started working more and more primarily in London as opposed to Bristol because, you know, you could just command the money a little bit more easier there, and it's just got that slightly more international scene. And I think with doing the abstract work, it just meant that I wasn't getting just pigeonholed in the street art world. And then I came to work with a gallery in Bristol around 2014-15, and they sort of picked up on the abstract work, having had it in a few auctions and getting some success. They've been quite a good long-term gallery. They're called Clifton Fine Art. They've been good, but now they won't take any of my crocodile stuff. So you're kind of like trying to get some kind of clout with galleries, but a lot of galleries are just so come and go and transient, whereas if you do the DIY shows and keep it topped up with that seems to help things go forward, because unless you're like a real household name or you just do that kind of slightly kitschy art, it's quite hard to keep galleries full-time, or you know, you've got to be a blue chip artist, you know.
Yeah, it was like to be underground, isn't it? They move, oh, this is the latest thing. He's nobody. Yeah, the big kind of artists that have got what they laughingly call legacy. But the rest of it is here today, gone tomorrow. Yeah. You were the first person to have a studio here at Rockaway.
Right.
I did a podcast with Mark. He talks about how, you know, the state his life was in at the time when he was breaking up the vans, and he decided, I've got to change my life, get back to where I was. And he said, the thing that really inspired me and made it all work was that Rowdy came here.
Oh, right,
Were you aware of that?
I mean, not necessarily. I think I realised I was slightly pivotal in terms of this space being a bit more of an art space, even though there were circus people here and creative people here. I painted like a Badger aeroplane through him, and then I did a big crocodile wall that's still here, and I think I could sort of see the potential of like a scrapyard being somewhere that could be really cool as an alternative outsider art space. I could see that. obviously Mark's a big character anyway, you know, and sometimes you could be here, and especially where I'm placed, you wouldn't even know I'm here.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, and even though I got some artwork here, you know, with social media, and it's nothing to do with in-house social media. I'm talking about people who visit.
Yeah,
you still never know I'm here because there's so
yeah.
much to photograph and look at that, you know, I barely get on people's dial, like, you know. So I'm like, fuck, you know. So in a way, I've sort of become part of the furniture, and that's sort of good and bad, I think, you know.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's good in the fact that he said, because Rowdy came here, suddenly I believed it could work.
I think that's it.
I thought, if he has faith in me, I can make it work.
Definitely, yeah. I think so.
So you're
because,
absolutely key, integral inspiration.
Yeah, because I think what's worth saying is that this place is set in an old quarry, and around 2002 to 2005, I painted a series of quarry rock installations in the sort of neighbouring area around Holcombe Quarry. I did another place called Dead Woman's Bottom.
So you painted there?
Yeah, I painted there. So I just find a situation where there's a bunch of old boulders lying around, and I thought if they look right and I can find the right narrative, maybe I can turn that into some kind of installation and group a bunch of rocks. It was a bit... they were very colourful. I used to liken it to Andy Goldsworthy meets Ren and Stimpy. That was the kind of approach I try and take.
Yeah.
So I would just masonry paint them out really bright colours and then just sort of stick eyes and stuff on them. They were quite crude, but they were quite funny and immediate. And there was another place, Sanford, out. I think they make cider there, and it's out towards the airport, and it overlooks. You can look out towards Wales, and you see the two islands. Is it Lundy and the other one?
Yeah,
Flathome and Steephome, something like that. And you could actually see out towards Weston-super-Mare, so you'd be really high up, and it would be. And I'd just sort of break into these old quarries and just get on with it. And in a way, it was kind of funny because it was like this sort of slow release vandalism that I was doing, where occasionally I'd have to watch out for the odd dog walker. I mean, it was still kind of just about mobile phone time, but it's the sort of thing where it's like, God, this guy's really sort of spoiling my day, or I feel a bit awkward, or how can we have this happening? And, you know, and even if they phone the police, there's some man painting rocks with these bizarre kind of characters. I don't know what would have happened, you know. It would have been hard to have caught me doing it. And in fact, one morning, because I didn't have a vehicle or anything at the time, I'd even occasionally sleep out at these places. And one time I just made a fire and just slept out by the rocks. And I woke up about 5, 6 in the morning with a dog licking my face, you know. And I'm like there, like this sort of shark, and there's a caveman. And I'd done this kind of Moby Dick scene where I painted all these kind of like rock, even the little stones and pebbles, all individual colours, so it looked like different bits of the sea. So there was kind of white foam, and then there was a light blue and a dark blue, and I sort of sprayed the stick sort of silver. It's very out there kind of stuff. And it's like, and then there's this dog licking my face. And often the best thing to do when someone approaches you is like, just don't say anything. You might say morning or all right, like it's totally normal, but you kind of, and then I just go about their business, really, you know. You've just got to kind of make out you're there for a good reason, I suppose.
Okay, Rowdy, I'm going to leave it there. That's been absolutely fantastic. Really, really enjoyed talking to you. So
yeah, that's good. And I'm glad.
Anything else you want to say?
Not massively. I'm glad we sort of kind of got back to quarries in a way, and what great spaces they are. They're kind of like microclimates, and they have some kind of interest and energy. They've had a lot taken out of them, but we're kind of restoring some of these places. You know, they're kind of interested in that respect. You know, because land is so expensive in Britain, particularly in England, and quarries are one of the things you can actually, if you've got a long-term game, you know, I've talked about this with someone in Cornwall before, that you can maybe occupy them, and maybe 25 years later they might come good in a different way if you can sort of get in there and get your hands on one as a group or whatever. It's a good thing, and it just encapsulates Rockaway. I think because it's got more built up, you wouldn't necessarily know it's in a quarry, so it's you know, quarry to scrapyard to sort of outsider art space, really. And anything else I want to say is, if you go to Instagram, I'm called @Rowdy Unofficial, and that's probably the main and easiest way to sort of get hold of me. Other routes are available. Good luck with that.
Yeah. Well, we'll put all the links and whatever under the podcast. Rowdy, thanks a lot. Really enjoyed it.